There are some key technical differences between a workgroup and domain that we have to be aware of. To take a look at the workgroup first. A workgroup, something like this, you would typically see on a home network, a very small network. In a workgroup, there is no centralized authentication. What that means is that if you have 3 computers, we'll say these are in your home network, and I'm just going to call them computers 1, 2, and 3. If you want to log into these computers, let's say you're Bob Ross, you need to log into all 3 of these computers from time to time. What you would have to do, assuming computer 1 is your primary computer, but you want to log into computer 3, someone would have to go to computer 3 and would have to create a user account for Bob Ross on computer 3. That's the only way you would be able to log into it. These computers have no relationship to each other than they physically reside on the same network. That's it. There's no shared authentication or anything like that. Somebody would have to create a user account on any of those computers if you actually wanted to log into it. There's also no centralized administration. What we mean by that, if I want to configure the firewall, I have to physically touch each of these computers. So there's no place you can go and say, I want to configure this setting and I want it to apply to all 3 computers right now. You can't do that in a workgroup environment. Each computer has to be configured independent of the others. There's also a technical limit, maximum of 20 computers supported. Now, what that actually means, let's say you have a shared folder on computer 1. I want users on computer 2 and 3 to be able to browse to this share and copy a file or something like that. Well, if you only have these 2 computers, that's fine. But let's say you have 25 computers. If you have 25 users on different computers that try to browse the share at the same time, they're actually going to get an error message that tells them the maximum number of connections has been exceeded. So when this says max of 20 computers supported, the reason I use the word supported is because that would be concurrent connections. More than 20 computers, you could potentially run into problems. Now, you could have 100 computers in your workgroup. As long as they don't try to access the same shared resource at the same time, that's a non-issue. So from a support point of view, 20 would be the limit. A workgroup is also considered to have low security. Now, some people try to debate this, but that is Microsoft's stance, that it is low security. What's interesting is the reason they say it's low security. Now, Windows 10, you can say that's a secure operating system. It is the most secure operating client OS that Microsoft has ever released. Server 2019 is the most secure server operating system. But the reason in a workgroup we have low security is because you have to configure each individual computer. For example, let's say you want to block an application. I'm just going to write block app. Well, you want to do that on all these computers. That would actually mean you have to go to the firewall on computer 1 and you have to block that application. Then somebody has to do that on computer 2, then on computer 3, individually, one at a time. If you're deploying Windows updates, same thing. Has to be done on one computer at a time. So really, the low security actually loops back to no centralized administration. More things just fall through the cracks. Contrast that with a domain environment. It's really the opposite in many ways. In a domain environment, we have centralized authentication. What we mean by that, let's say you have your 3 computers. In a domain environment, you're going to have a server. We'll say server 2019. This server is going to be configured with Active Directory Domain Services. ADDS is what it's always called. When you configure that, that makes this server a domain controller. So what happens now I go to this domain controller, this ADDS software, and on the server, I will create a user for Bob Ross and I'll set the password. I no longer do that on the individual computers. So what happens now, we just saw earlier that you go through control panel system. That's one way to join these computers to the domain. So I'm going to join all three of these computers to the domain. What happens now, when Bob Ross sits at computer 1, tries to log on, he types in his username and password. Those credentials are passed back to the server running Active Directory, the domain controller, and it verifies that it's the right username, that it's the right password. Assuming those are true, Bob is fully authenticated, and now he's able to log on from computer 1. With that, he could also log on to computer 3. Let's say at work, computer 1, that's Bob's primary computer, but the hard drive failed in that machine. And it's going to take us a while, maybe half a day, because we have to, get a hard drive. Somebody has to take the time to put it in. Well, we don't want Bob to be unproductive for the half a day while we, get somebody to replace his hard drive and reimage his machine. So what we do is give Bob Ross computer 3, a loaner computer. Well, now Bob, who has never used this computer before, he'll sit at this computer and he'll sign in using his username and password, but it gets passed back to the domain controller. Username and password correct. Bob is fully authenticated. He has access to the same applications on the network, the same resources on the network, like shared folders, websites, all those things, independent of the computer he is actually using. So that's our centralized authentication. We also have centralized administration. Let's go back to the firewall example. If I wanted to block a certain application on all computers in the entire domain, that could be dozens, hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of computers. I could go to my domain controller and we'll use this utility called group policy. We dig more into that shortly, but through group policy, I can manage more than 3,000 settings. I would simply add a firewall rule that says block a specific application. Now, that rule actually processes out to all the computers in my domain, if that's what I want. But it's going to apply to multiple computers, so it eliminates the need of me going from one computer to another, making a change. You can centrally administer all your configurations and restrictions. So for that reason, this is considered to have high security, just because it's more simplistic to manage compared to a work group where you're touching every single computer. And there is no limit to the number of computers that can be joined to a domain. Microsoft says theoretically a domain can have 40 billion objects. That's billion with a B. Needless to say, you will never get to the point where you get a message that tells you the domain is full. So truly, it's an unlimited number of users, computers, other objects you can have in a domain.